what I'm trying to do today is give you a bit of a potted version of the webinar series that we're running through AICD, and that in turn is a potted version of the book that I wrote on the topic. So I can't help, please forgive me momentarily if I give that a small plug, but it's called Developing Your Director Career, and I published it with AICD for this very reason, that in the domain of boardrooms and directorships, there is a very high demand and a high interest in this very topic of how to get on boards. Some would say a surprisingly high level of interest in it, given the issues which I think we might even explore a little bit later in the panel discussion around some of the pitfalls. Let's put them nicely and call them pitfalls. For instance, in the AICD courses, for those of you who've ever been near the AICD 5-day company director course, you know that the way it's split up, day 2 is my personal favourite. It's legal day, and at the beginning of legal day, it's customary to sort of make the observation that our sort of number one KPI is not to have participants running out of the room at the end of the day saying, why would I do it? And of course, when you look at the practice of directorship through the lens of legal cases, the courts aren't full of happy news stories, and neither are the newspapers. So I think if you think over recent times and current times, of course, it's already been alluded to, the banking inquiry raises a number of governance issues, but that's already just covered over the last one, which was Cricket Australia, which is covered over the last one, which is the Commission of Inquiry into Institutional Abuse. These governance issues go right the breadth and depth of our society. So people say, why would you do it? Well, my goal today is to actually lead in, I guess, to the panel discussion with a very impassioned plea for all the positive reasons why you would do it. But I'm actually going to hold that, as I say, to the end and until we sort of sit together and have a bit of a talk about it as a panel. So instead, let me just talk about, I have an assumption that you've come here today because you do have an interest in one way, shape or form in the business of getting on boards. I would just appreciate a little show of hands to get an understanding of how many people already have some type of directorship or board experience. So can I just get a bit of a show of hands? And for those of you, keep your hands up if it's paid board experience. So not surprisingly fewer with the paid board experience, but quite a lot with obviously voluntary, not-for-profit or other unpaid board positions. The context in which we're operating today, or the landscape, is ASIC has in the order of 2.5 million companies registered. Of those 2.5 million companies, 2,000 of them are listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, Australian Securities Exchange. And so we know the lion's share of 2.5 million companies are private companies, or they might be what are known as public companies, but not listed companies. So for a lot of the not-for-profit boards that people sit on, a lot of those will go to make up the 2.5 million entities. So I've roughly said we've got this landscape of 2.5 million companies, the lion's share of which are private companies. So they might be large family-owned businesses or private companies that do have boards of directors, or they might be your own investment family company. So it's hard to get a handle on exactly how many companies in our country have boards of directors that are looking for people to populate them. Suffice to say, there are a lot. And in addition to what is registered with ASIC, at the last count, ACNC tells us that there are some 54,000 registered charities. Of course, there will be some crossover, as I say, between the 2.5 million companies and the 54,000 registered charities, but that's a lot of boards. They pretty well all have boards of one kind or another. Public sector, I couldn't do the figures. Maybe in this room, some of you might have better access to the data than I. but naturally across the country, both at the Commonwealth level and in each of the states and territories, there are an enormous number of government-owned, statutory-owned enterprises and corporations, statutory bodies, and so on. And then, of course, there are others again that are not captured in those numbers. They might be church entities that are not incorporated as companies or vehicles in the conventional sense, but are simply a whole range of different types of organisations operating under the auspices of a church. So there are a lot of board seats in this country. And therefore it is often surprising to people how very difficult it is to get one. Of course, once you do get one, and you are in the club, because there is still a clubness about it, which I'd also be happy to talk a bit about later. Once you're in the network, it's naturally easier. But breaking in is what really trips most people up, and it's what led to us writing the book. So I'd like to, as was mentioned, I'm going to sort of talk. I'm just going to put all of these up for you and have a look at these different types of methods that are used to get people onto boards. And as you saw the arrow sliding along the spectrum there, one of the difficulties is that because boards operate in so many different domains, private family, not-for-profit charities, public sector, etc., the means by which people get onto the boards varies tremendously. So I've got at one end of the spectrum what I would call the ad hoc method, by which I mean, and I guess going back 10 and 20 years, most boards used the ad hoc method, which was who the chair knew. And sometimes the chair might ask the other directors, but pretty well who the chair knew. Sometimes even perhaps a bit more alarmingly who the CEO knew, and I'll talk a little bit later about why I find that more alarming again. But it was very ad hoc. We'll just ask someone because we know that they'll contribute something good to the board. At the other end of the spectrum is the highly structured method, if you like, that you see particularly for most public sector statutory bodies and certainly for ASX-listed companies, a very formal, external-facing, recruitment-based process. And we can talk a bit about recruiters later if you wish to, but I'm not going to spend any time in the presentation on that. But at that end of the spectrum, the recruitment process will be like any other day job. Call for applications, a very rigorous process, interview process, etc. And then somewhere in the middle is a midway position. And this is what I find most family-owned or private businesses will do, and most not-for-profits. They either won't be able to afford or they won't be prepared to spend family business money on detailed recruitment processes. So they will use more, again, their network, market sounding to try to find the directors that they want. So point one, I guess, the point one takeaway for me out of the art and the science of getting on boards is being in the right networks. And so identifying networks where people are who make decisions about recommendations to other directors about people they come across. Those are the networks that are really important. And I'm not just giving a plug to our host and to AICD, but organisations, institutes like these are classically a large part of that network. So being in those networks is absolutely critical, because even if you do get into the sort of the more structured recruitment-based methodologies at the other end of the spectrum, so the ASX listed and the government and statutory owned, you will find that at the end of the day, behind the arras, when the board or the chair or the nominations committee gets the short list from the recruiter, they'll sit around the table and say, does anyone know any of these people? So they will still absolutely want to do their own market sounding, and people might say, well, I don't, but I know such and such on the board of so-and-so where I see they've got some experience, so we'll look into that. So lots, as I say, point one, the network is absolutely critical. I'm going to, in the middle, I'm going to talk a bit later a bit more about the nominations type, the midway position, the nominations type processes that boards sometimes use. So my starting position, I guess, is that this, in order for you to convert from I have an interest in getting on boards, and maybe you are, as indicated earlier, many of you are already have some level of experience in that regard. So in order to convert from I want to get on boards or more boards to being on said boards, first and foremost, number one, I think, is to have a very clear sense of what you can contribute to a board. What are the attributes that you have that would be attractive to a board? People in this space say over and over, if you approach the business of getting onto a board from a point of view of, I want to get on boards, as opposed to, I have these capabilities to contribute to a boardroom, you will have a much harder time if you start with the, I want to get on boards. You have to have a much stronger sense of what it is you can contribute to boards rather than that you have an entitlement to get on boards, if you know what I mean. So the other day I was in a forum where someone said, I met somebody the other day at a particular conference, and she was a vital, up and coming sort of new generation. And I said to her, so what are your goals for this year? She said, I want to get on 3 boards. And this guy said to me, so what do you think we look for in people getting on boards? And I said, well, I hate to say that to that aspirant, but actually, if someone says to me, what are your goals? I want to get on 3 boards. The first thing I think is they're not ready for boards. Because they're thinking about it in terms of their desire to get on a board, as opposed to, I have this suite of skills and experience and my background that I think would make a contribution to a board. So think as much about what might not be so attractive about you to a board and work on that. So, and let's talk about what I think boards do look for. So this is, I said earlier, this is an art and a science. There's a bit of science to it, but my experience mainly art. In terms of the science, what boards are increasingly doing is, whether they use external recruiters or whether they don't, they will put together a skills matrix. They'll call it all sorts of different things, typically a skills matrix, board composition matrix. And increasingly boards think about the type of person or people they're looking for, individually and as a whole, across 4 dimensions, namely what skills, what balance of skills we need, what balance of experience and backgrounds we need, what I call attributes, and I'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment, and what demographic balance we want on the board. And so this dummied, simplistic version is just trying to indicate the ABCD across the columns, across the page. Literally they will say, who have we got on the board? Director A, we want these skills, these skills, these skills, this experience, this balance, and this director has these skills, this experience, but doesn't have this experience. So they'll literally do an exercise, not just of ticking and crossing these days, but usually rating, because we love rating everyone. And so what are we looking for? We're looking for someone with much higher level skills in such and such an area. So to be a bit more granular about that, this might be, for instance, under the heading of skills, this might be qualifications. You are in a sweet spot. Boards love people with financial governance skills and qualifications. For my sins, by background, I'm a lawyer and I'm recovering from that, and life's going quite well, and have friends on the outside. But when people say, it's the 2 things you need on boards are lawyers and accountants, I can honestly say, hand on heart, I say you far more need accountants or financial governance people than you do lawyers. And I'm happy to talk about reasons for that in a moment. But even then, there's accountants and lawyers and engineers and medicos and medicos. And when we're talking professional skills and backgrounds, those are really just because of the types of problems and discussions the board has, not because I'm at pains to say, not because the lawyer on the board's meant to give all the legal advice. In fact, the opposite is true. Lawyers on boards that even let their own firm give legal advice go into very dangerous territory. So let alone that it's seen that they are there for that purpose. They are there for the purpose of understanding the domains and the topics that the board deals with and the ways. It is interesting to me, having sat on something over 20 boards now over the past 25 years, I'd have to say my personal favourite professional type is the engineer. I thought lawyers were systems process thinkers until I sat on a board full of engineers, and that was a fascinating experience. And literally, the combination of backgrounds is more about the different styles of thinking and sort of what we talk about these days as cognitive biases that we bring. And they do differ between even professional groups. So a board in a particular area might identify 4 or 5 different skills, qualifications. Skills could be something that's not particularly a qualification too, such as project management. We're an infrastructure project and we want an infrastructure company and we want people on the board that understand project management. So that could be a number of things. And given in any particular type of company, there might, you can appreciate, be a whole range of specific skills. So in a not-for-profit dedicated to intellectual disability, an understanding of the issues that affect that particular sector or organisation. In terms of experience, this tends to be more about the industry or the sector, people that have perhaps high levels of experience in government relationships, in stakeholder relationships, international experience. Again, could be a number of different types of things based on what the company or the organisation does. So the board in its matrix will identify those things and literally assess its members and see where the gaps are, what it's looking for. So if point 1 was work your networks and point 2 was do this from the point of view of what you can contribute, not your sort of right to be on a board, point 3 is always understand the context, the type of skills and backgrounds that the board is looking for. Do some research to understand whether you match what they're looking for, because you shouldn't waste your time, for that matter, or theirs, if it's not going to meet their needs. And then the second half of that matrix, you will recall, I had attributes and demographics. So attributes are difficult to test for. This is where people will mainly do their background checking. When they'll talk to the network, if you're in a short list for a board role, and they go and do their quiet checking behind the scenes, and they ask the questions about how you operate in your day job, or in other board roles you've had, they will ask things like, is he, she a team player? That's a big question. It's a big question because it's a fundamental difference from our day jobs, that you are only ever part of the board as a collective decision-making vehicle. So are they a team player or somebody that likes to operate on their own? Strategic, are they a strategic sort of thinker, creative? All sorts of questions they will ask that are about the way in which you can contribute to that collective decision-making environment. And hence, there's a longer list than that. But curiosity alone is highly sought after, and we can never go past the great emotional intelligence factor. How well do they operate in a team environment with other people? Demographic balance, this is becoming more and more a part of the equation as well. Skills and experience and backgrounds is in some ways easier to evaluate in a quantitative sense, to tick, yes, they've got that qualification, tick, they've worked in that industry. The demographics is about, obviously, the board as a whole. Do we have too many old people, too many young people? Do we have too many homogenously the same of any kind, whatever that might be? I'm on a personal crusade to stop talking about targets of 30% women on boards. I think our target should be 40% of each gender on every board. That's just my personal target. And because I chair a school board, a girls' school board, girls' schools can fall into the mistake of having not enough men. Isn't that an interesting problem? So we should think about this as it's not an equity issue. I know I'm at pains to say it's not an equity issue. It's a diversity of thinking issue, that we have people that think about problems differently, come at them differently. So I often, again, like to use lawyers because we make a nice butt of any joke. If you have a board full of lawyers and one's old and one's young and one's black and one's white and one's male and one's female and one's Muslim and one's Christian, what have you got? What have you got? You've got a bunch of lawyers. So it's clearly a much more complex set of factors than just that. So all of those factors will come into play. The board will look at the picture of what they are and what they need. So then I think in addition to what the particular board needs at the particular point in time, it is important to understand what the job is and how it's different from your day job, whether that's as a professional or an executive, whatever background you come out of, what is the job of the board. I won't try to do justice to this topic here because, again, both hosts today, there's lots of materials, courses, training, etc. available, and we can't do justice to it here. But it is absolutely critical to understand what governing is as opposed to managing, which is that strategic oversight, understanding the difference between the board governing and overseeing and management doing and implementing. And so, as I say, that's as much as I'll say about that. And when you go into the detail of that question of what boards do and what management does, the TRICA model is known and loved. It's over 20 years old now, so it's stood the test of time, and it still tells the story. In terms of what boards do, again, whistle-stop tour of the TRICA model. On the two sides of that grid, the board is responsible for the performance of the organisation, so the performance roles, strategy and policy, and on this side of the grid, the compliance roles, the accountability roles, monitoring and supervising, and that's where some of those liability issues come up for boards most predominantly. And critically, the central linchpin on the TRICA model there in the centre, therefore, working with and through the CEO. So once you have an understanding of what the board's looking for and hopefully do have an understanding of what boards do as opposed to what management does, those of you already sitting on boards will of course already be gaining that. And there's something to be said for even the smallest of organisations through to the largest of organisations. They will all give you different experiences and perspectives in that regard. So you can gain your knowledge and understanding what that really means in practice through not-for-profits, sporting clubs, private companies, all sorts of different boardrooms. So now I'm just going to sort of pick over the last few slides, I guess, are really a few, probably as much as anything, provocations or thoughts that might lead into our discussion later. In terms of there's a lot of formal thinking about what the board role is about, the TRICA model, governance versus managing, etc. What I think is absolutely key from my own experience is to think about the ultimate role of the board being to drive the success of the organisation with an understanding of what its purpose is. So setting the light on the hill is that's what I mean by that. Driving the strategy and having a deep understanding of what it is that we're in this business for. I've touched on this already. The collective decision making is what the board is all about. You have no, even as chair of the board, you have no power or authority whatsoever as an individual. Only as part of the collective. The board only ever makes decisions as a collective. So if you aren't a team player, some people hate boards for that reason alone. They get to the board table and they say, "Wow, gee, I've got to wait for everybody else," and they find it very slow and painful in the extreme, particularly often coming out of executive backgrounds where they've been used to doing. It's also critical, and this I think is particularly difficult sometimes for the professions. We have responsibility for all aspects of decision making, not just the ones we're comfortable with. So that's why getting across the nature of the business, and even so, as I've self-declared, for me, I'm not a financially trained board member. I've learnt it on the job. I've done a lot of training, and that's been absolutely essential. But I'll never have the same high level of depth of understanding as those of my colleagues on boards who are financially trained. But I'm equally responsible and potentially liable. So having an understanding of that is absolutely critical. I've touched on EQ, the importance of emotional intelligence and understanding how people tick and how they work. So what does that mean for you then? Thank you. If you are sort of stepping back and looking at the business of getting on boards, there are some truths. One is, if you're just CV building, it won't work. Boards very quickly find out people who just are CV building but don't really want to work hard. Because I think sometimes people have a bit of a false idea that boards are a really good choice because they're nice and flexible, and I can manage my nice portfolio lifestyle around the edges. And then when they sit on 2 or 3 boards, you can never plan for something going wrong on every one of your boards at one time adequately, because that will happen. The time, the flexibility also means you are called to be flexible about attending and being available for all sorts of out-of-session meetings. Lone wolves, don't go near it. If you like working on your own, this is the flip side of the collective. The lone wolf is a very unhappy beast in a boardroom. So I'll just leave it there. I'd also say that, again, one of the problems with high-performing Type A individuals, and there's lots of you, us, them, in boardrooms, it can be a folly to go to the board thinking, I've got to have all the answers. In fact, that's completely not what you're there for. You are completely there to ask the questions rather than give the answers. Management is largely there to give the answers. The collective of the board might sometimes come up with the answer. You as an individual are not there to, which we're often used to in our substantive professional life. So bringing that experience and that background to a really good conversation and changing your mind far more often than getting your argument up is my experience. And then in terms of the very pragmatic issue of people being available for the job, overly committed people are not welcome, and uncommitted people are not welcome, those who don't want to go those extra yards. So those are some of the pitfalls, I guess, and or some of the considerations for you as an individual. And I guess we need to. Oh, sorry, I flipped over that too quickly. We need to sort of think about those skills in terms of the flip side, your desire to contribute rather than just CV building. What skills and capacities you have to be part of that collective decision-making environment, and your readiness in terms of your availability, your time availability, etc. And I guess then the only other sort of points that you need to think about in this context. We've talked, or I've talked a couple of times now about start from the point of view of what can I contribute to a board, to the board in question, but the other aspect, I guess, is be prepared to be audacious and take a risk. I often think we talk about getting on boards it's very difficult to break in, but I sometimes think people hold back for too long, saying, well, I don't think I've got anything to contribute. So a preparedness to make yourself vulnerable and say, well, I do. One of the points I'm going to finish with in a moment is the importance of having a boardroom champion. This is the person who is an experienced company director, who is your coach, if you like, but not in a formal sense. They are your champion. And that will be a person who is able to reflect back to you that as long as you are prepared to make yourself vulnerable in participating in board decisions in areas that you are not overly comfortable with, and you are prepared to learn and you're prepared to put in the time, if you do have that ability to contribute, be audacious and tell people. Sometimes people forget that. Tell people you are interested in getting on boards, because that is absolutely critical that they know that. The rest of the points there, I think we've probably touched on in terms of the EQ and understanding the breadth of financial governance and other skills that are needed. So in the wash-up, I guess beware of being typecast by your day job. So you're not going onto boards just as I say, with one particular skill set background. You're going onto a board to be a director across the breadth of issues that the board will deal with in its deliberations. You do need to, I really do strongly believe that it needs to be something that will be of interest to you, because if it's not, you will very quickly lose interest and be unprepared to spend. In my case, I don't know, we'll hear from Glenn a little bit later, most directors I know read their board papers at night and on the weekends, no matter how many other boards, or whether they're full-time directors or otherwise. So if you do not have that sort of interest and the ability to gain an interest in an industry or sector, just don't go near it. The time as well, we might talk about that in discussion. I think what sort of time commitment it involves to be on a board, not just in its formal meetings and so on, but in the relationships that you'll need to build within the board and also within the stakeholder management and other stakeholders of the company. So get the board CV ready, and I also, one thing I haven't really spoken about today, but in the webinars and in the book we do talk a lot about develop your value proposition. So this is a short statement that once you've thought about all of those things and you sit, and I'd encourage you to sit down and write this out. What do you have that would be of value to a board? And it's different from your day job. It's actually quite a difficult discipline. And it's not, you don't do that because anyone will ask you to present your value proposition or to make it as a statement, but because when you meet people at chartered accountants functions or AICD functions and you express an interest and they say, oh, okay, so what's your background? It's a mindset. It's the way you tell your story about what it is that you bring. What's the story of you? So I think it's absolutely critical. I've said find something that interests you, be something that you can be passionate about, and so I think you would understand that comment. And I alluded to this earlier, but I can't overemphasise be really good at your day job, because that's where, into your first board position in particular, it is from your day job that you're most likely to either find this opportunity or somebody will do some checking on you. And truly, finally, find your champion, as I say, your boardroom champion. So this is a practising director. In my experience, most senior directors are incredibly not only generous with their time, they actually like to feel important and asked. So ask them for a coffee and that you would like some guidance about what you might be able to contribute, and they will usually end up being your most important referee for your directorship CV. And often they will be the one ringing you saying, I've spoken to so-and-so and I've told them to put you on the list for an interview. So do make sure that you find your champion. In terms of why do it, I know that we have planned to have a bit of discussion about this in the panel session, so I'll probably reserve my comments for that discussion. And suffice to say that the end point, and I'll explain my thoughts about this in a moment, but the end point for me is that it is an incredibly enriching, stimulating, satisfying walk of life. It far outweighs the reality of the spectre of liability, which so often drives people the other way. But I'll leave that dangling as a temptation to talk about a little bit later. I think my time is done, so I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll move to the chairs, I think is the idea, and relinquish the microphone to Karen. Thank you.
My name's Karen Middleton. I'm from the Filthy Media, as you were just reminded. I'm a journalist I work for the Saturday paper, which is a weekly newspaper published by Schwartz Media. Joining me here today is Elizabeth, who you have already met, and Glenn Keys, who is a local hero, local champion, and a very active member of the Canberra business community. Glenn was the ACT Australian of the Year in 2015, that was right. He's the co-founder and co-executive chairman of Aspen Medical, and the founder and chair of Project Independence, which is a housing initiative for people with intellectual disabilities. He's also on the board of the National Capital Authority still, yes, and chair of the Canberra Business Chamber, and a board member of the NDIA, which works with intersects with the National Disability Insurance.
It's the agency that runs the scheme for the
That's
NDIS.
right, the NDIS. And I believe you're also on the board of the Invictus Games?
I am.
Right, busy person. Okay. Now, I want to start today by congratulating Renee on her prophetic skills for organising this event in this particular week, given the goings-on in a particular hearing room in Melbourne all week. So I thought I'd start by just telling you that the Treasurer this morning has announced more penalties for executive misbehaviour. And in that news conference, and here's something to put the fear of God in all of us, he said, "Let's not forget here, it's not just chief executives. Boards, at the end of the day, are responsible for these organisations, and there will be a lot of focus on executives where executives haven't been able to deliver here." And of course, he's talking about the Banking Royal Commission. "At the end of the day, the boards of these organisations are the custodians, really, of the governance, and I'm sure that that will have plenty of attention as the Commission carries on its important work." Now, before you run screaming from the room, changing your mind about wanting to be on boards, let's start with the warmer and fuzzier stuff maybe. And seeing as we've heard from Elizabeth, I might start with you, Glenn, and let's pick up the issue that Elizabeth finished on, which is why be on a board? We've heard maybe why we shouldn't be a little bit, and I want to come back to that as well, but why be on a board? What's your reason for doing it?
I've actually never asked to be on a board. So I've always been asked or established an entity that needed a board. I love for the work I do. I love being strategic and looking at a vision and achieving stuff that others haven't done. And that's a really key role of the board, is to sit there and provide that oversight and guidance. And I've really, really enjoyed that. We were chatting over lunch. I think I've got far more out of boards from a learning experience than I've contributed. And hopefully that doesn't make anyone that I'm on a board now get rid of me, but it's just been incredible. The quality of people you meet, the dedication of people. You were talking about the time that people give on boards to reading and prepping, and then saying, "Oh, I read this on the board, so I went away and researched that, and I discussed this, and I met with those people." But the quality of people you meet and their level of thought and experience is extraordinary. I do think, though, that one point that perhaps echoes what you've spoken about, but interestingly often doesn't get spoken about, is around boards providing a value set. And I think that's something that that's a hard call, right? You think it's a hard call, but you have a look at boards that have had some horrendous actions around the Me Too campaign, these sort of actions for banks. An enormous amount comes down to value set. It doesn't even need to get to governance. It's around saying, what is that line, and when did we decide that we'd step over it and just keep happily wandering away from it? Yeah. And I think that's when it's a real challenge. But actually, that's when it's exciting. And I've just been through a recent board experience where we've had to terminate a senior executive for sexual harassment. And as the board, it was actually a pretty brief discussion. We spent far more time discussing how we were going to support the staff and the organisation post the individual's departure than should this individual go. And that value set, I think, is really critical, because sometimes you do get caught up in so many other aspects of a board around the numbers and the legal requirements and the strategic vision and stuff. So the opportunities to learn that and see it face to face rather than read it in the paper, that's cool.
Yes, on the issue of that liability question, we've some people may have heard the Chief Executive of AMP has resigned today in the wake of the evidence given to the Royal Commission earlier in the week, Banking Royal Commission. It's not clear yet what role the board may have had directly in that, whether he put his hand up and left or whether they asked him to leave, but clearly there will be boards all over the country and perhaps overseas holding meetings urgently to look at these questions of liability, and I do want to come back to that. But Elizabeth, you spoke about, at the end there, about why serve on boards, and there's a kind of an altruistic element to it sometimes, I guess, depending on what kind of board we're talking about. But it struck me that you were talking about the motivation and that really it should be seen as a job, not a prize, perhaps.
Yes.
So why do it? And when you say it shouldn't be about looking good on your CV, isn't it okay to think, well, it will look good on my CV provided I put in the right amount of effort? How do you balance that judgment?
Yeah.
You don't want to be just being altruistic. You are thinking about your own reputation and you're advancing yourself as well, presumably. Can you talk a bit about that?
No, absolutely, Karen. I agree. The point I was trying to make was, if your only motivation is CV building, then you've got it wrong. Obviously, I think, and I really agree with what you just said, Glenn, about setting the values and the tone, the culture. Everything's about culture at the moment, as if it's almost as if a certain regulator or regulators have invented the idea that companies have culture. But leaving that aside for a moment, the board's role in setting culture and setting values is extraordinary, and so I think that if you need to align what I would call your cultural and your risk appetite with any board that you seek to serve on. So by that I mean, I've certainly seen boards and worked with boards that I could not serve on because it would not work with my own risk appetite and my own cultural and values fit. So that's part of the exercise too. I do want things that align with who I am and certainly don't harm my reputation. But the driver needs to be, what can I contribute to the board?
Well, perhaps without being specific, what kinds of things are we talking about there when you say, oh, but my risk appetite is not high enough for that?
So certainly I've had experience on some private company boards where the private typically, and I know, Glenn, you've got some relevant experience in that sort of private area, where, particularly for private or family-owned businesses, where they will say, we're not in a public reporting domain, so we don't sort of put a whole lot of our resources into, say, compliance.
Right.
At the other end of the spectrum, I have known directors. So I've had some statutory government-owned corporation experience in Queensland, statutory-owned enterprise. They're all in this same boat. Where at the other end of the spectrum, your appetite to embarrass the minister, as you know, is extremely low. So you will put an enormous amount of resourcing into all sorts of compliance that some directors just find frustrating in the extreme. They don't like operating in that environment. They prefer that sort of by the seat of your pants kind of environment that I was describing a moment ago. So it can be as simple as that, or it can be what the organisation does. There are certainly certain social purposes that I feel aligned with, and some that I would not sit around the board table in a month of Sundays.
Right.
That's what I mean about.
I should have said at the beginning, sorry, we'll make some time for questions at the end. So if you do have a question, make a note of it and I'll call on you when we finish this. We'll leave some 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. Glenn, what about this point about private companies versus publicly listed companies? Do you, reflecting on what Elizabeth said, do you find that sometimes the governance might be a bit fuzzy around the edges on a private company where there's more transparency with a publicly listed company and it's different? And I'm also interested in, as people looking to serve on boards, the difference between volunteer service and paid service, whether one relates to the other, whether they're so different as to not be useful to each other. Do you have reflections on either of those points?
Yeah, so the first one is absolutely, private companies, particularly smaller companies, the governance pretty light on because typically, they'll walk from at the front desk or the warehouse or their office and they'll all walk into the boardroom and they'll get a beer and we better have a board meeting and who's taking the minutes today. And, they're having a board because they have to have a board, but you know, is it really everything it should be? No, the answer is not. And I know that when we started our company, that was definitely the case. There was, it was just my business partner and I on the
Say
board.
Board Matters Pty Ltd. Exactly the same. Yeah, it's a private business with a sole shareholder.
Your business, yeah.
That's right.
So you say, you know, we started small, but then as we started to grow and we wanted to get larger clients, we wanted to get government business, we said, right, you know what, we want to make sure that the board stands up. And we're also thinking to the future and think if we want to sell the business or we want to bring in an investor or we can do a trade sale, someone's going to come up and say, where's your board papers? Who's on your board? So we thought, right, it's time to step up. So we went away, we thought about it, we recruited a board, made sure that everybody had AICD training, we engaged around people, and then on our subsidiaries as we grew, then we said, right, let's get independent boards onto those and grew that as well. So I think it's a life cycle of us as we grow, you know, out of school through uni and we learn skills and we become more adept and mature. Boards do too as companies grow. The danger is those companies that are bigger with quite a lot of money and quite a lot of employees but are still flying by the seat of their pants. They're the high risk ones. That if you get invited onto a board and you're being done because they just want to say they've got a board, but they actually don't really want to hear the various things you spoke about of questioning and all of that sort of stuff, you know, run as far as you can from those. To answer your question about the volunteer boards, I think there is a staggering amount of applicability between the two. Typically, they still have a budget, so they've still got to run to budget. They don't want to go broke. You're maybe paying people or you'll be doing events or raising money for something. You'll still want to ensure that people are treated well. If you've got employment contracts, you want to check there's no bullying and harassment and all of those governance oversights elements. So I think there's an enormous applicability into that. And for those people who are wanting to stretch themselves, so, you know, to be careful not to say, I want a board on my CV, because that'll look cool, but to say I want to stretch myself and, you know, I've seen that board and I reckon I could do better than that. So I want to learn how that works. Volunteer boards are perfect because you get to, you know, stakes are not super high. You've usually got a good support mechanism around you. You can learn. People are very comfortable with you asking questions and going, not sure how we would do this, what should we do? And they're a great stepping off point. It also acts very well for networking.
Yeah,
so that people go, oh, I see that, you know, Blogs is on the Salvation Army board or on the RSPCA board. And, you know, they might ask you to then step up to a state or a federal board.
So
Suddenly,
boards beget boards.
Oh, absolutely. And it's to your point, which is where the chairman used to say, well, I've got 5 friends who I know well, let's get all of them on the board. You know, that's a dangerous model because then you've got 5 key people who are all thinking exactly the same. Typically, you know, if we don't have to go back many years, but are, you know, male, pale and stale, and they're the group that sits there, there's no diversity whatsoever. But if you can look at people on different boards that you've seen, particularly volunteers or otherwise, you can easily create diversity and know that they've got an interest and good experience.
Absolutely.
I'm a volunteer on a board of a community organisation, and I know a lot of what we focus on as the board is fundraising, is helping to support the organisation in managing its relationships within the community that it works in and with its client base. But I wonder, for those of us who haven't served in paid positions, what does it actually involve if you're working on the board of a big company, other than reading the papers and having your brain, you know, tapped for ideas and that kind of thing when you're physically in the room? What else is involved if people are interested in that kind of work?
Are you distinguishing, you mean on the paid boards?
Yeah, on the paid boards.
Yeah, so I agree with Glenn. It's actually the same job. It's just a different level of sophistication of the management team is the main difference, usually. In other words, in a not-for-profit, they will often, I was talking earlier about, you know, the lawyer on the board who makes the mistake of thinking they're there to give the legal advice. Not-for-profits, in reality, will absolutely turn to the lawyer on the board and the accountant on the board and the marketing person. Can you look at our releases? You know, they will try to use those skills to a much higher level. So the main difference in the pay, and I should say, I'm not suggesting that's a good thing. That's a very dangerous thing to do on whether paid or unpaid boards, which we can talk about further if you like. But in the paid board, you will normally have, by very virtue of the fact they are paying directors for all the reasons Glenn said earlier, it's a larger, more evolved company. That they've got budget to pay directors, so they work you pretty hard in the sense of expecting you to be there. But they will very rarely call on your day job skills to try to redo your management's job. If anything, they will work hard to push to stop you interfering in management's work. So it really is that high level collective, the values setting, the culture setting, the strategic level decision making that you're participating in. It's much the same.
Let's talk about the time commitment, because we can quantify the time involved in perhaps reading the papers beforehand and attending the meetings, whether they're monthly or bi-monthly or whatever. What other calls on your time might there be? Are there many in a paid position, in fact, but also in a voluntary position?
I do want to talk to this just a little bit, because I think a lot of people will think I'm reading board papers and they think they're reading a 20 or 30 page board pack.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
I had a
Glenn.
board meeting yesterday that was 183 pages.
And they're regularly 300 pages. Or
So don't
Yeah.
leave it till 10 minutes before
No,
you leave.
don't think as I'm sitting in the car out front, I'll just quickly flick.
That's right.
Because they'll be complex and you'll have to go through. On a large complex board that I'm on, luckily they've come down, but I know the record number in my head, it was 844 pages for a board. And you need to, so when people say I've got to read papers, I think before I started on boards, I had no idea what that meant. And that time to sit down and say, God, if I'm reading 200, 300, 400, 500 pages, I can't just sit down even on a weekend and read that and consume it.
You've got to make time to do
days
that.
You've got to make time. And then and what I do is I go back, and so I'll pick the areas where I see concern or something where I think I need to make clear comment on, and I'll go back and I might even do a bit of work around that and get ready. A lot of board packs now are electronic, so that's very helpful because you can highlight and tab mark and all sorts of stuff. But that board commitment of reading and interpreting is really critical. And if you've got time, you might want to allow yourself time to go, I'm really worried about this, so I'm going to give Elizabeth a call and just have a chat to see, am I off mark on this? Rather than getting in the meeting and grandstanding and everybody going, you realise you completely misread that. That you've not helped yourself at all. So the interpretation, rather than just reading, I think is something that should not be underestimated. And sometimes people, because they've done a volunteer board where they've rushed out and they've got a 6-page board pack, think, yep, I'm off to a company board. It might be 10 pages, but, that's a different thing. The other commitments come around with things like, I'm on quite a number of subcommittees, so bigger boards will have, you always get finance and audit, and you might get nominations. Depending on what it is, there might be specialist ones. So on the NDIA, there's an IT subcommittee. So I've been on that for a number of years. So the committee times for that. And then to get ready for those subcommittees, you might have other meetings. And if you end up as a chair of a subcommittee or a chair of a board, your time effort goes through the roof, because then you are consulting with other members, talking to the CEO, perhaps the CFO, pulling stuff together. So where people run around, and that lady who spoke, I want to be on 3 boards.
Yeah.
I'd be worried if I was her boss, because I don't know which part of my salary is now being chewed up by you getting ready on your other boards.
And Karen, I'd just add to that, and I put it in the dot point, but the rough formula, and again it varies from time to time and board to board, but the rough formula for me is about find out how many hours they meet for, and allow 2 to 3 times that for the reading of the papers, both board meetings, committee meetings. And so very quickly, one of the boards I sit on meets for a whole day every 6 weeks. So, and it literally is 2 to 3 days reading. So it won't just be one night or on the weekend. You'll be reading all through the kind of 10-day lead up to when you get the pack.
I want to talk about the risks involved in being on a board. And Glenn just mentioned, you finding something that doesn't make sense to you in those board papers and thinking, I don't like the look of this. What is the way you go about raising an alarm if there is something that concerns you? What's the method to do that? Consulting outside, is that against the rules really? Is that wise? Do you then have to put your hand up in the meeting and say, sorry, I think this is wrong?
Well, I think it is a natural extension of what Glenn was talking about before, that in the lead up to the meeting. So I kept saying you have no power, no authority as an individual director, and you don't. You have, you're only part of the collective. But ironically, and this is where the company directors course legal day is the don't scare people to the point where they're going to run away and never do this, because even though you only have authority as part of a collective, your liability is personal. So individual by individual around the table in the legal cases, the courts say, what did he do? What did she do? What did she do? And if a director has not sort of made efforts to understand a topic, all they're doing is setting themselves up for a fall. So that example you gave of I might read it and think, this is not my strength area. I'm not really. I think I'm missing something.
Might be a balance sheet question, or it might be something else.
Correct. And I ring one of my fellow directors and say, can I just talk this through with you, because this isn't making sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense to both of you, then you go, great, okay, well, we've got to have some other conversations about it. At the extreme, though, you sort of referred to the, advice from outside. In 25 years, I'm delighted to say I've never had to take advice from outside because, and that's not to say I haven't had some board experiences that have been a bit frightening, and where not all the directors are on the same page, but 99-point-something% of the time, the effort is well spent in doing that before the board meeting, having the conversations, so that when you go into the board meeting, you can raise those flags, and it's normally dealt with in the normal sequence of the board. But sometimes that can go for months. It can be a problem that is not just solved in the course of one decision at one board meeting.
Glenn, what are the risks that you weigh up if you're thinking about joining a board? Are they personal risks to you, and how do you weigh those things up? Is it just about the kind of board it is, the subject matter that it deals with, the area that it operates in, or are you looking at, if it's a company, the company's history, its finances? What do you weigh up?
Look, it's a lot of those things. I go, Elizabeth's point's really valid. It's got to resonate. You've got to be there because you want to be there. You think this is a company or it's a not-for-profit that's doing something, and it's obviously something that resonates for you, for your board, you're doing that.
And you with the Invictus Games, the same thing.
That's right. So you think, right, that's something that I can do. The next bit is, can I contribute? Am I going to be able to contribute? And I must admit, I'm a pretty straightforward sort of guy. So when I've been rung to join boards, I normally go, oh, wow, that's cool. Why do you want me?
Yeah.
And I don't mind asking that because I can sit there and guess why I think they might want me. But when they go, well, you've got business experience was really cool, so I think I'll pick Invictus. You're ex-defence and you've got a child with a disability, so you understand disability. We think that's a really, really good mix for the board. And I go, oh, okay, I hadn't thought of it in that light. But that's, so I find doing that's important because then you understand, and sometimes you can go, yeah, that's not right.
Yeah.
you haven't quite understood who I am. That's not what I can bring. So rather than thinking I'm a great mix, if you ask them, they'll tell you. Time commitment's really important. I was glad to see you had that because it is really critical. Some boards are really cool, and I've been asked for a couple that I've said no to recently, and as much as I would have loved to have done them, that the commitment, not just with boards and a company, but personal time as well. I've stepped away, I've just taken over guardianship for a couple of family members, and I've just said, I just don't have enough hours in the day here, and if I'm going to make a commitment to a board, I've got to give it. I've got to read, and I've got to think, and I've got to be able to do a out of session. So, and then finally, there's value set. So if someone rang me up and said, got a tobacco company that we're kicking off and I'd really, really like you to join, I'm not going to do that.
That's something you wouldn't want.
Great example.
No, and I think, to be honest, I think understanding absolutely where your value set is, that you might say, well, no, I think it's right. If it's tobacco, it's cool. It's a choice. People can make it. No one's forcing them to. It's fine. I don't mind that at all.
Yep.
Great. Then that's a personal decision. But understand where the circle is that you will and won't step out of, and own that.
And I
be
guess
proud of it.
Be prepared. Be prepared to defend your choice and your role if that, whatever the company is, the field that it's in is controversial in some respects. You may be asked to account for for yourself and your decision, your judgment, your reason, your values.
Yeah, and I think it's a pretty simple rule. It's a 60 minutes moment to me, which is when we're sitting on a board and we've made a decision, that you say if we suddenly got the press turned up at the door am I comfortable walk at the door and defend that decision? Knowing that my family and all my friends and all my network will see me, am I comfortable making that call?
Yep.
And if the answer's no, well, then you need to perhaps go back and reconsider either whether you're on that board or if the board's made that right decision.
I'm conscious of the time, and I just want to toss two more things at you, and I'll perhaps toss them to you as a job lot, and you can decide how you
Yep.
want to deal with them. The first is managing conflict of interest, which follows on a little bit from what you've been talking about. That some boards might have the wrong idea about what you can contribute, but at the same time, you've got to be conscious, I guess, of where a conflict of interest might occur for you. For example, I'm a working journalist and I have to be careful that I'm not sitting on a board of an organisation I might have to report on. That would be a conflict for me. How do you manage that? And secondly, I'm looking at the Banking Royal Commission and some of the other examples that you touched on, Elizabeth, that we've seen issues with board management. Cricket Australia recently, and the churches and agencies in the Child Sexual Abuse Royal Commission. And it strikes me that in the examples of all of these circumstances, there have been competing constituencies. In the case of the banks, shareholders versus their customers, with the churches, their parishioners and the people using their services versus the institutional church, and with Cricket Australia, perhaps its institution and the players versus the fans, that kind of thing. How do you manage? Do you think about that as a board member, your conflicting constituencies, and how do you juggle those two things? And then the question of conflict of interest, either of you on either?
You choose your job lot. Glenn.
Okay,
You choose your job lot.
so conflict of interest. Is everybody here from Canberra? Is most people here from Canberra? So you will all realise that there are not 6 degrees of separation in Canberra. At best, there's one, right? And so conflict of interest on boards in Canberra is an enormous issue, right? Because people go, oh, you're on the business chamber and you're on the NCA and you're on the board of the National Disability and you're the, so I once heard someone say, oh no, it's a confluence of interest,
Yes.
not a conflict of
yes.
interest, right?
Danger, danger.
Yeah, but it's very, very simple. If someone had said, you're on the board of the NCA and now we would like you to be on the board of a major property developer, I'd go, well, that operates in Canberra. You go, very simple. I can't imagine how I would deconflict those. But for a lot of them, and that's the joy of keeping a regular update on what your other conflicts will be, is that you update them and then you go through the agenda. You've gone through your the agenda that comes out hopefully beforehand, and you can go, ooh, I could have a conflict on item 3.
And is disclosure enough?
Well, it all depends how it is. Is that you might actually say, I don't even want to see the papers on that topic, and I'll absent myself from the room, and the minutes will be extracted. That's far right of
Depending on
arc.
severity,
Left of arc might be as simple as you've declared it. We don't think it's an issue. It's in the minutes, and we've told the relevant person. But conflict of interest is really, really critical, and honestly, in Canberra, particularly if you're on more than one board, it'll happen almost immediately.
And Elizabeth, do you have any view on the idea of conflicting or competing constituencies for
Yes,
a board?
so both of your throw them out there topics could fill this room all afternoon.
I know, and
I've
I've already been naughty and
So I'm going to be
stolen extra time.
really brief and say I found it hard to choose between those two points anyway. So the conflicting constituencies issue is a personal interest of mine because for my sins I've just started my PhD in the topic of fitness for purpose of boards for the 21st century.
You have
And
more
my-
than 24 hours in every day, clearly.
Well, I have to find it, but my proposition is that in fact this is our very problem, that boards we're moving from a belief system that the board is the principal, is the agent for the principal shareholders. That model is well past its use-by date. And there's a great and emerging school of thought that talks about the board as the mediating the hierarchy of interests of the competing interests of the stakeholders in the organisation. Much more useful way to think about it. And I think it is actually how boards do act now, that they've gone way past. We still see cases where they clearly haven't done that. They've just acted, slavishly in the interest of the profit of the shareholders. But most boards, I think, are now saying, well, it's quite apart from anything else, whatever else you believe, if you mess up with the customers or with the constituents or the broader community and they trash us in social media or they sue us, you don't look after the interests of the shareholders anyway. So I think that is now a much clearer mindset for directors.
We've got some time for some questions. I'm conscious I've kind of stolen a bit of it, but does anyone have a question for either Glenn or Elizabeth or both? Yep, just over here. There's a mic just coming to you there. That'll be a bit helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the speeches today. So you talk about diversity and how we always generally focus on gender, experience, and things like that. But I guess these days with social enterprises and entrepreneurs and small businesses, really making a scene, when I look at bios of board members, I don't really see a lot in these fields. So I guess I'm just wondering, do you think it's a choice of people saying, look, I'm a small business, I don't really want to focus on board? No, they may or may not be team players, but I'm just wondering whether it's a choice by the individuals or whether boards don't see, I guess, the experience that they would bring to the board.
You mean in terms of a diversity of backgrounds?
Yes.
Right.
So was that age, or were you saying, or?
Sorry, let me clarify. So I mean, we talk about age and
And
Oh,
gender,
okay, and
Gender.
So all other types of.
yeah. You don't, I'm just wondering. hearing your view.
ethnicity,
No,
life experience,
Yes.
qualification, all sorts of things, yeah.
Definitely, it's all of the above. In my experience, and it depends on the nature of the business and the board or the organisation as to what they think is particularly sort of important types of diversity. But I think I guess the point I was trying to get at earlier about, it's not an equity issue, it's about better decision making. So boards of all kinds are struggling with, they haven't made enough inroads into getting diversity of, in age, quite apart from anything else, let alone cultural backgrounds and geography and, all sorts of different demographics. But what boards are increasingly appreciating is if we all look the same in a cognitive sense, if we all think the same way, it's a bad thing. So they're struggling with it. But part of it is there's a stage of life too where, for all the reasons we were talking about before, where you will not be able to fit all of those extra hours of reading and everything. And so that's my point about the fitness for purpose of boards for the 21st century. We're still labouring under that old industrial revolution model and can't understand why we can't get young people and, different types of people engaged because of that model that demands a particular type of commitment.
And I guess if the board follows the model of who do you know, then they
Yeah.
may not be rating the issue
No.
of diversity and a diverse range of skills
Yeah.
as highly as
Yeah.
others, beyond we need someone who's good at finance and can manage the books, and we need someone who
And
is a lawyer.
there is still the unconscious bias problem.
Right.
So they mean it. They're not just saying it. They mean it, but then in the processes they'll say, conventional looking male or female. Yep, they're the right one because they're a bit frightened of the difference.
I think the other thing that boards are also struggling with is that they feel like they have to be diverse, right? They're being told, be
Yeah.
diverse, and they're doing exactly the thing you're saying, which is they're looking across going, okay, so I
Tick the
need
box.
need gender, I need race, I should have someone who's Indigenous, I need someone who's young and old, I need someone who's from a customer, so they do this and suddenly going, well, I can't have 32 people on the board.
No.
Right? So part of the thing that I think boards need to do more of around diversity is to say, what is the diversity we need that suits our business? Whatever that is, whether it's a not-for-profit or a business, but to say, is it around age? Do we, if I'm selling, if I've got a business that's only around people who are in the aged care sector, do I really need to have a 25-year-old on the board? Is that really that critical? Maybe no, maybe it's not. But what I really need perhaps is some racial diversity because of that.
Or maybe I need a 75-year-old because we've got started getting them.
To force yourself to look at what is the diversity mix and to step outside the block of, and I think the unconscious bias thing is really interesting because I've seen a few examples where they start with a very diverse group and it seems to look like exactly who they had before by the time they get to the end.
So I'm sorry, Karen, I did one little anecdote of a board that was sort of looking, it had done its matrix and it needed these skills, experience, backgrounds, and said, but we need a woman. because it was an all-male board. And I said to them, so you do know that being a woman is not a skill set, right?
Yeah.
So here's a surprise for
It's a
you.
skill you're born with.
Here's,
Yeah.
here's a surprise for you. You tell me the skills and backgrounds you need, and we'll probably find a woman.
Yes.
As opposed to starting with
Yeah.
that.
Cart before the horse,
Yeah.
cliche.
Yeah.
Do we have another quick question? There's one just up the back here. Yeah. I don't want to keep you all from your day jobs, so we'll move through them
Because
quickly.
you've got to be really good at those.
Yeah, you've got to be really good at that.
I suppose it's a quick one. As an accountant, we've got the Institute as our support if we need help or assistance or anything like that. But as a board member, apart from fellow board members, is there such an organisation out there that we can,
You
know,
played into their hands. The
I was gonna
Australian
say, what
Institute
a-
of Company Directors
What a plug.
has...
No, but for not-for-profit organisations
Yeah.
such as small entities, you know, when we do it for voluntary work and we're going, well,
And you're not
this
going to
is-
be doing the company director's course necessarily.
Yeah, you don't,
Yeah.
and you're not aware of the framework that you're operating in,
Yeah.
the organisation that you're managing. You don't know what the rules are.
Feel a bit unsure about it all.
Yeah. So how do you go about finding out that type of thing?
But AIC, like in all seriousness, AICD has 41,000 members now, and they are across for-profit and not-for-profit. You know, they do cover all domains of company directorship. And then there are a number of other industry sort of sectoral organisations and things like that. So in, say, schools, there are schools associations in each of the states and territories that will be very specifically about school governance or in the arts. But AICD is, as I say, does cover all those domains.
They actually have specific courses
Yeah,
just
for
for
not-for-profits.
not-for-profit boards, which are run here in Canberra, and they're very, very good. They actually have the head, I think it's the head of not-for-profit AICD is based here in Canberra. So for the whole of AICD, great guy. But on top of that, a lot of not-for-profits will band together and say, look, why don't we, we'll all chip in a little bit and we'll get a course and we'll put all of our various directors on that. And I know there is some grant funding out there as well for not-for-profit board members to go and get board training.
And
So
yeah.
honestly, it's not hard to find. There
No.
are people nodding their heads in this very room
Who'll be
who
happy
would
to
be
talk
very
to you
happy to give you more
afterwards.
detail on that. But don't feel that just because it's a, I think one of the very first boards I sat on was a school board,
Yeah.
that just because you're on a school board and it doesn't have a very big budget, maybe I can get by without it. Just find a way to get on one of those courses. Because the other thing you do around your network, you'll meet 15 people you didn't know before from a whole range of different backgrounds and paths and networks who will remember you, and they'll link you in for a board position coming up later on if you're interested.
Yeah.
Is there one final question before I get dragged
was
off the
one
stage
over
of the
here.
Shepherd's Crook? Yes, great.
Thank you, great presentation. My question is about the liability of the board. At the moment we've seen the CEO of AMP step down, and I guess whilst we might know the specific circumstances or what the board did or didn't know, but what would you think, should the board step down, and what things would you look at for that to happen?
Don't look at me.
I'm just
Well, I
worried
think
that
the
I'm on
no,
a webinar
let's-
talking about the board of AMP.
No,
Yeah,
let's not talk about AMP, but let's
No,
talk about a
no.
hypothetical board whose
Yeah.
whose company becomes engaged in controversial activity
Yep.
that may or may not be subject to further investigation. What legal liabilities do you have as a board member if you did or didn't know about it?
So I can't help twitching to
Yeah.
to make a comment about that in that hypothetical type of scenario that,
No.
that you mentioned.
Yeah.
My first reaction is the last thing a board should do when the crisis hits is stand down. Absolute last thing they should do, and that's because whether a board has done something wrong in any given scenario, and we can look back at some of the actual cases in history, like James Hardie, those types of cases
Yeah.
that have actually been tried as much as anything, and say what the courts and what the system looks for is, did they breach their fundamental duty of care and diligence by not seeing what was going on and not doing something about it? That's really what it comes down to. Intrinsic to that fundamental duty of care and diligence is the duty to fix the problems that have happened on your watch.
Yeah.
And you stand down today and leave it to it. You know, it might get to the point in any given scenario where people are baying for blood and it's seen by the chair perhaps as the best thing I can do for this company is stand down, but that would certainly not be until you try to fix it. And then the discussion amongst the board might be, I think we're causing more trouble by not making a change internally. But if the whole board went, it would be an absolute disaster because you have no authority, no ability to fix it from outside.
And I guess as an individual board member, it comes back to the point you were making about you notice something that seems unusual. If this is what happens,
Yeah.
you check with a colleague, and then you are supposed to have the courage to speak up rather than stay
Yeah.
silent because you have a legal obligation in the end as well. Is that right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I agree entirely. If you're at an organisation that's had a horrendous crisis, you know, I think if you've been willing to be a board member and take, you know, sometimes remuneration to be there, you don't bail when things get hard. That's when you dig in and you fix it. Now, you might very clearly say, right, I'm going to get this to a path of recovery,
Yep.
and then I will go because, you know, I've not done my job back here,
Yep.
but by God, I'll do my job here and I will get to there. And I think that's really critical.
Yeah.
And there's so many nuances around, you know, sadly, who has to be thrown under the bus at various times as you move forward, and those things happen. But I do have to, I'm not trying to be trivial when I say this, if you've got the right inquiring sort of mind that Elizabeth was talking about, you're asking, you're putting stuff on record, and you've got a strong value set, I actually think most of those things will never, ever happen.
Yeah, that-
Liability
yeah.
becomes such a distant reality
Yeah.
because you've asked all the right questions, you've done stuff, even if you're in a business that's starting to fade and, you know, it's being passed by technology, whatever else, you'll make the decision and you'll wind the business
Yeah.
up and you've done everything you can, but you're not going to be in a court because you've met your responsibility.
And can I just add, that is absolutely borne out by legal cases. You can write on one page the number of legal cases in Australian history about directors' duties failures. The vast majority of those millions and millions and millions of company directors get it right because they do that. And every now and then one gets caught out rightly or wrongly. But I think just a sort of final comment on that for me, Mike Smith, who's the chair of 7-Eleven, it's all a matter of public record, and he was recently speaking and saying, and in his instance, again, matter of public record, he had been on the board of and assumed the chair of AICD. When the crisis hit with 7-Eleven, he took the responsible action of stepping off other boards, including AICD, putting all of his energy into fixing that scenario. And I heard him speaking recently, and I thought it was one of the most brilliant bits of advice I ever heard, which was that directors need to spend more time walking around in the shadows of the boundaries of their business. That for me was gold, because I think that's what assures you that you're getting the information you need.
It's a nice poetic note on which to finish. Thank you all again for your attention, and would you please join me in thanking Glenn Keys and Elizabeth Janison.
Thank you.